The music pulsed through the walls, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. Berlin was alive, glowing with neon and the electric promise of adventure. It was the perfect backdrop for Kate's bachelorette party. She'd always dreamed of a wild, unforgettable night with her best friends in a city that never seemed to sleep. We delivered. We started with cocktails in a rooftop bar, the city stretching beneath us like a maze of possibilities. As the night deepened, we danced through clubs one after another, a kaleidoscope of strobe lights and laughter. It was exhilarating. For a few hours I forgot everything, work stress, family obligations, even the subtle unease I'd been feeling in my marriage. My husband Daniel and I had been together for almost 10 years. Lately, though, something had shifted. He seemed distant, distracted. I chalked it up to work pressure and tried not to let the gnawing anxiety get to me. But tonight wasn't about him. It was about Kate. By the time we reached the third club, a sprawling underground space with a pounding techno beat, I was buzzed but not drunk, my mind still sharp. We poured onto the dance floor, a chaotic sea of strangers moving as one. Kate was glowing, her white dress catching every flicker of light. I danced until my feet ached, sweat beading on my skin, feeling more alive than I had in months. Then somewhere amidst the chaos I turned toward the bar. My gaze swept the room almost absently, and that's when I saw him. Daniel. At first my brain refused to process it. He was supposed to be back home in Chicago, working late shifts and managing deadlines. And yet there he was, in the heart of Berlin, standing against a wall with his head bent toward a woman I didn't recognize. Her hair was dark and glossy, her dress short and fitted. She leaned into him, and I watched in stunned horror as his hand slid down her back. Then, as if to shatter any lingering hope that I was imagining things, their lips met. My world tilted. For a moment the music faded, the crowd blurred, and all I could hear was the sound of my heart breaking. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. Horrifying, inescapable, surreal. I stood frozen, my limbs paralyzed as reality slammed into me. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. This wasn't some cruel trick of my imagination. My husband was in Berlin, kissing another woman while I stood no more than 20 feet away. Emma. Kate's voice broke through the haze. She was at my side, her smile fading when she saw my face. What's wrong? I couldn't answer. My throat was tight, words tangled behind the lump rising in my chest. Instead, I gestured toward the corner where Daniel was now whispering something in the woman's ear. Kate followed my gaze, her expression hardening in an instant. Is that? She started, but I didn't let her finish. I pushed through the crowd, my legs moving on autopilot. Each step felt like wading through quicksand, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed answers. I needed to understand. When I reached him, I grabbed his arm without thinking. Daniel. His name came out sharper than I intended, cutting through the din. He turned, and the look on his face when he saw me, shock, guilt, and something I couldn't quite place, was like a knife to my chest. Emma, he stammered, pulling away from the woman, who looked equally startled. What are you doing here? What am I doing here? My voice cracked. What are you doing here? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence was deafening, confirming everything I didn't want to believe. The woman glanced between us, her confusion quickly morphing into discomfort. I didn't know, she started, but I cut her off. Save it, I snapped, my gaze fixed on Daniel. Explain. Now. He ran a hand through his hair, his usual calm unraveling. It's not what it looks like, he said finally, the most cliché response imaginable. Really? Because it looks like my husband flew halfway across the world to cheat on me. The woman slipped away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving us alone in the eye of the storm. Daniel reached for me, but I stepped back, the distance between us feeling insurmountable. Emma, please, he said, his voice pleading. I can explain. Don't. My voice was steadier than I felt. Whatever excuse you're about to give, I don't want to hear it. Not here, not now. I turned and walked away, my vision blurred by tears. Kate found me near the exit, her arms wrapping around me as I broke down. The rest of the night was a haze. We left the club, the bachelorette party forgotten, and returned to our hotel. I spent hours replaying the scene in my head, searching for signs I'd missed, wondering how I could have been so blind. By morning I knew one thing for certain. My life would never be the same. The next morning, Berlin's gray sky mirrored the heaviness in my chest. The city's once thrilling vibrancy now felt oppressive. The streets too loud, the people too close. I sat by the hotel window, my untouched coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at nothing in particular. Sleep had been elusive. Every attempt to close my eyes met with the vivid replay of the previous night. Daniel's face, the woman's smile, the way they had moved together as if the rest of the world didn't exist, it all haunted me. Kate knocked softly before stepping into the room. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside me, her hand resting on my knee. "I canceled the rest of the plans," she said finally. "No one expects you to." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is your weekend. I'm not going to ruin it." "You're not ruining anything, Emma." Her tone was firm but kind. Her eyes filled with a concern that only made me feel worse. I shook my head. "I can't let this overshadow everything. Go have fun. Pretend I'm not here if you have to, but don't let my mess ruin your celebration." Kate hesitated, then sighed. "If you're sure." Elite. Once she left, I finally let the tears come. They fell silently at first, a slow trickle, but soon I was sobbing, my body shaking with the force of it. I felt stupid, humiliated, angry, not just at Daniel but at myself. How had I not seen this coming? The signs were there, weren't they? The late nights, the unexplained absences, the way he'd stopped looking at me like I was the center of his world. The pain was unbearable, but beneath it was a simmering rage. He hadn't just betrayed me. He'd disrespected me. To cheat on me was one thing, but to do it so brazenly in a city where I could catch him, where the risk of discovery was so high, it felt like a slap in the face. By midday, I couldn't stand the thought of staying cooped up in the hotel room any longer. I needed air, movement, something to distract me from the endless loop of questions and accusations swirling in my mind. I wandered the streets of Berlin aimlessly, the city's charm lost on me. Couples walked hand in hand, their laughter grating against my raw nerves. Every smiling face felt like a personal affront, a reminder of what I'd lost, or maybe never truly had. Eventually, I found myself in a quiet cafe, the kind of place where tourists and locals mingled over coffee and pastries. I ordered something, though I couldn't remember what, and sat by the window, staring at the bustling street outside. My phone buzzed. I glanced at it, my heart sinking when I saw Daniel's name. For a moment I debated ignoring him, letting him stew in whatever guilt or regret he might be feeling. But curiosity, or maybe masochism, got the better of me. I answered but didn't say anything, waiting for him to speak first. "Emma," he began, his voice tentative. "Can we talk?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Talk? Now you want to talk? Were you planning on talking when you flew to Berlin without telling me? Or when you kissed that woman in front of half the city?" He exhaled sharply, the sound crackling through the line. "I deserve that. I know I do. But please let me explain." "Fine," I said, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I wanted to hear him squirm. "Explain." There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he might hang up. Then he said, "It's not what you think." "Don't," I snapped. "Don't insult me by saying that. I know what I saw, Daniel. I was there. I'm not denying it," he said quickly. "But it wasn't planned, Emma. I came here for work. The woman, she's a colleague. Things just..." "Spare me the details," I interrupted, my voice cold. "What do you want from me, Daniel? Forgiveness? Understanding? Because right now, I don't have either to give." He sighed again, this time heavier. "I just want a chance to make things right." I didn't respond immediately, my fingers tightening around the phone. "You don't get to decide that," I said finally. "You don't get to shatter everything we built, and then ask me to sweep up the pieces." "Emma." "No," I cut him off. "I'm done talking. You wanted me to know? Well, now I know. And I hope she was worth it." I hung up before he could say anything else, my hands trembling as I set the phone down. The rush of adrenaline that came with cutting him off quickly faded, leaving me feeling hollow and drained. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I wandered some more, trying to lose myself in the city, but everything felt tainted. Berlin, with all its beauty and energy, had become a graveyard for my marriage. That night, back at the hotel, I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My eyes were red-rimmed, my face pale, my expression one I barely recognized. I looked like a stranger, someone lost, broken. But as I stood there, something shifted. The anger I'd felt earlier resurfaced, stronger this time. I wasn't going to let Daniel's betrayal define me. I wasn't going to let it consume me. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just a new chapter, one I hadn't expected but would have to navigate nonetheless. And for the first time since the night before, I felt a flicker of determination. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't let him or anyone else take away my power. The next morning I awoke with a strange sense of clarity, though my body felt like lead. The pain was still there, sharp and insistent, but it had dulled just enough to let another emotion seep through: resolve. I wasn't going to sit in the ruins of my marriage forever. If Daniel thought he could bulldoze through my life and leave me shattered, he was wrong. Kate knocked again, but this time I was already dressed, my bag slung over my shoulder. "I'm going for a walk," I told her before she could say anything. She raised an eyebrow. "Are you okay?" "No," I admitted. "But I will be." Kate hesitated, then nodded. "Call me if you need anything." "I will," I said, though I wasn't sure it was true. The air outside was crisp, carrying a hint of rain. I let it wash over me as I walked, my steps purposeful though I had no destination in mind. It wasn't about where I was going. It was about moving, about proving to myself that I could keep going, even when everything felt impossible. Eventually, I found myself in a quiet park, the kind with winding paths and benches tucked beneath sprawling trees. It was serene, a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I sat on a bench and pulled out my phone, hesitating before opening the Notes app. I began to type, not thinking too much about the words. "Dear Daniel," I wrote. "I saw you. I saw everything." And for a moment it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like my world had collapsed in an instant. But now, as I sit here in a city that feels both foreign and familiar, I realize something. I'm stronger than this. Stronger than you. The words came in a rush, pouring out of me like a flood. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed us. The life we built, the promises we made, the trust we shared. And for what? A moment of excitement? A fleeting thrill? I'll never understand it, and I don't think I want to. What I do know is this: I deserve better. I deserve someone who sees me, who values me, who doesn't need to be reminded of what he has. And maybe that person isn't you. Maybe it never was. My fingers hovered over the screen, trembling slightly. I debated whether to send it, whether to confront him with the truth I was only just beginning to realize myself. But I didn't. Instead, I saved it as a draft and tucked my phone away, feeling a strange sense of catharsis. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet reflection. I wandered through museums and markets, letting the city's energy seep into me. Berlin had always been a place of reinvention, a city that thrived on its ability to rebuild. If it could rise from the ashes, maybe I could too. By evening, I was back at the hotel, sitting with Kate and the rest of the group in the lounge. They were careful around me, their laughter subdued, their questions gentle. It was kind but also exhausting. I didn't want to be the fragile one, the woman whose life had unraveled in a single night. "I'm fine," I said at one point, cutting through their concern. "Really? You don't have to tiptoe around me." Kate frowned. "Emma, you don't have to put on a brave face for us." "I'm not," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. "I'm hurt and I'm angry and I don't know what happens next. But I'll figure it out. I always do." The others exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. But Kate just nodded, her eyes softening. "You will," she said simply. That night I slept better than I expected. My dreams were restless but free of the vivid, painful images that had haunted me before. When I woke, I felt lighter. Not whole, not healed, but like a weight had been lifted, even if just a little. I spent the next few days trying to reclaim the trip, throwing myself into the city's culture and history. I visited the Berlin Wall, its graffiti-covered remnants a testament to resilience. I walked along the Spree River, the water glinting in the sunlight, and let myself imagine a future where I wasn't tied to Daniel's betrayal. But Berlin wasn't just a city of reflection. It was a city of life. One night, as the group ventured out again, I decided to join them. Not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. I wanted to feel alive, to dance, to laugh. Even if it was only for a moment. We ended up in a small, dimly lit club, the music more mellow than the pounding techno of our first night. I found myself at the bar, nursing a cocktail, when a man approached. He was tall, with an easy smile and a warm energy that put me at ease. "Rough night?" he asked, his accent unmistakably German. "Rough week," I corrected, surprising myself with the honesty. He chuckled. "Well, you're in the right place to forget about it, at least for a little while." We talked for a while, the conversation light and easy. He didn't pry, didn't ask about the sadness I was sure still lingered in my eyes. Instead, he made me laugh. A real, genuine laugh that felt foreign after the heaviness of the past few days. When he asked me to dance, I hesitated for only a moment before saying yes. The music was slow, the kind that encouraged closeness, but there was nothing uncomfortable about it. As we moved together, I realized something. I wasn't broken. Bruised maybe. Wounded definitely. But not broken. And as the night wore on, I began to feel the first stirrings of hope. Hope that I could move on. Hope that I could rebuild. Hope that someday I would look back on this moment not with pain, but with gratitude for the strength it had forced me to find. I wasn't there yet, but for the first time I believed I could be. The days in Berlin passed in a strange, almost surreal blur. Each morning, I woke up feeling slightly less like the version of myself who had stumbled into that club and seen her life torn apart. The pain hadn't disappeared. It lingered, sharp and insistent, like a bruise that hadn't yet begun to fade. But with each passing hour, I started to understand something important. This was my life, and I wasn't going to let Daniel's betrayal define it. On our last day in the city, Kate and I sat on the steps of the Berliner Dom, watching tourists and locals mill about the plaza. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, the kind of day that made the city sparkle with possibility. I sipped from a bottle of water, my sunglasses hiding my still slightly swollen eyes. "You know," Kate said after a long stretch of silence, "I've never seen you like this. Not even after, well, you know." She was referring to a rough patch I'd had years ago, before Daniel and I got married. A bad breakup, a tough job situation. A string of small crises that had left me feeling untethered. But that time had been different. Back then, I'd felt like a victim of circumstances beyond my control. This time, the pain felt personal, deliberate, like someone had carefully carved into my heart with a razor blade. "I'm not the same person I was then," I said finally, my voice calm. Kate nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're not. You're stronger now, even if you don't feel like it yet." Her words settled over me like a warm blanket, comforting but also challenging. Strength. Was that what this was? Surviving something that should have broken me? It didn't feel like strength. It felt like endurance, like putting one foot in front of the other because stopping wasn't an option. That afternoon we wandered through one last museum. The kind of place filled with abstract art and thought-provoking exhibits. One installation caught my eye. A massive wall covered in tiny mirrors, each reflecting a different fragment of the room. Standing in front of it, I saw myself from 100 angles, fragmented and incomplete, yet undeniably present. It felt like a metaphor for my life at that moment. Shattered, yes, but still whole in some strange, inexplicable way. I lingered there longer than I intended, lost in the reflections, until Kate touched my arm gently. "Ready?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, tearing my gaze away from the mirrors. "Yeah, I'm ready." The flight back to Chicago was uneventful, but the weight of what waited for me at home grew heavier with each mile. By the time we landed, I felt like I was carrying the weight of the entire plane on my shoulders. I told Daniel not to pick me up from the airport. I wasn't ready to see him yet, but part of me still half expected to find him waiting. He wasn't, and I wasn't sure if that was a relief or another small wound to add to the collection. The apartment felt different when I walked in, though nothing had changed. The same furniture, the same photos on the walls, the same faint smell of the candles I always lit in the evenings. But it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a space I no longer belonged to. A stage where I'd played a part in a story that had ended without warning. I dropped my bags by the door and wandered into the living room, my gaze landing on a photo of Daniel and me from our honeymoon. We looked so happy, so carefree. I wondered if that version of us had ever truly existed, or if it had been an illusion all along. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Daniel. "Can we talk?" It read. I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a response. Not yet. It was all I could manage. I wasn't ready to face him, to hear whatever excuses or explanations he had prepared. I needed time to process, to figure out what I wanted, if I wanted anything from him at all. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work, hoping the routine would distract me. It helped to an extent. The constant flow of emails, meetings, and deadlines left little room for introspection. But the nights were harder. Alone in the apartment, the memories crept in, uninvited and relentless. One evening, I opened the draft of the letter I'd written in Berlin. Reading it again, I was struck by how raw and honest it was. Every word felt like a piece of my soul laid bare. But as I read, I realized something else. The letter wasn't for Daniel. It was for me. I didn't need him to read it. I didn't need his validation or his guilt. What I needed was to reclaim my sense of self, to remember who I was before I became half of us. That weekend, I packed a bag and drove to a small cabin I'd rented on a whim. It was nestled in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and the kind of quiet that made you confront your thoughts whether you wanted to or not. The first day, I did nothing but sit on the porch, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves. By the second day, I felt the beginnings of peace, a tentative, fragile thing but real nonetheless. I thought about Daniel, of course, about the life we'd built and the life we'd lost. But I also thought about myself, about what I wanted and who I wanted to be. By the time I returned to the city, I knew what I had to do. I called Daniel and told him we needed to meet. He suggested dinner at a restaurant we used to love, but I declined. I didn't want the weight of memories clouding the conversation. Instead, we met at a neutral spot, a park halfway between his office and our apartment. When I saw him, my heart twisted painfully. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed, his shoulders slumped. But I couldn't let myself feel sorry for him. This was his doing, his choice. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice cautious. I nodded, keeping my distance. "Say what you need to say." He launched into an explanation, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. He apologized, he begged, he tried to rationalize what he'd done. But as I listened, I realized that nothing he said would change the facts. He'd broken my trust, shattered our foundation, and no amount of remorse could rebuild it. When he finished, I took a deep breath. "I believe you're sorry," I said. "But sorry isn't enough. I can't undo what you've done, and I can't pretend it didn't happen. I need to move on. And so do you." His face crumpled, but I didn't waver. I couldn't. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control, of agency. That night, as I packed a suitcase and booked a short-term rental across town, I felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and most surprisingly, hope. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. It was mine to shape. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. In the days that followed, my new apartment began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a sanctuary. It was small, just a studio with a creaky floor and a view of the alley, but it was mine. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but I took comfort in the blankness of it all. It was a canvas, a chance to rebuild from nothing. I started to fill the space slowly, deliberately. A colorful rug for the living room, a few framed photos that didn't include Daniel, a stack of books I'd always meant to read but never had the time for. Each piece felt like a reclamation, a reminder that I could shape my own world now. I avoided contact with him as much as I could. His messages trickled in at first, apologies and questions that I read but didn't answer. Over time, they grew less frequent until one day they stopped altogether. I didn't feel triumphant when his silence finally came, just a sense of closure, a quiet acknowledgement that our chapter was truly over. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into every project, staying late at the office and volunteering for assignments I would have avoided before. My colleagues noticed, and for the first time I started to see my efforts rewarded. My boss pulled me aside after a particularly successful presentation and hinted at a promotion. It wasn't much, but it was something. A reminder that I was capable, that I could thrive on my own. But life wasn't just about work. Slowly, I began to explore what joy looked like in this new phase of my life. I took a painting class on a whim, even though I'd never held a brush before. I signed up for yoga, though my balance was laughable at best. I started cooking meals for myself, experimenting with recipes I used to think were too complicated. It wasn't about becoming a new person. It was about rediscovering the parts of myself I'd neglected. For years, I'd poured so much of my energy into being Daniel's partner, into maintaining a life that revolved around us, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just be Emma. One Saturday, I decided to tackle a hike I'd always wanted to try but never had the chance to. It was a 2-hour drive to the trailhead, and as I wound my way through the forested roads, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs as I started the ascent. The trail was steep in places, challenging but not overwhelming. I passed other hikers along the way, some in pairs, some in groups, but many walking alone like me. We exchanged polite nods or brief smiles, a silent acknowledgement of shared solitude. When I reached the summit, the view took my breath away. The landscape stretched out endlessly, a patchwork of green and gold under the afternoon sun. I sat on a rock and let the stillness wash over me, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. It was there, on that quiet mountaintop, that I allowed myself to fully release the last threads of pain. I didn't forgive Daniel, not in the way people often talked about forgiveness, but I let go of the anger, the bitterness that had been weighing me down. He had made his choices and I had made mine. His betrayal didn't define me, and it never would. As I made my way back down the trail, I felt lighter, like I'd left something behind at the summit. Over the weeks that followed, I started to feel a sense of balance returning to my life. I wasn't healed, not entirely. There were still moments of sadness, of doubt. But those moments were fewer and farther between, and when they came, I let myself feel them without letting them consume me. One evening, as I sat on my couch with a glass of wine and a book, my phone buzzed. It was Kate. "How's the new place?" she asked when I picked up. "Getting there," I said, glancing around at the still bare walls. "It's starting to feel like home." "That's good," she said. There was a pause, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice before she continued. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe we should plan a trip. Just us. A chance to unwind, get away from everything for a while." I smiled at the suggestion. "Where are you thinking?" "Anywhere you want," she said. "Paris, Tokyo, a beach somewhere. You name it." The idea of traveling again felt both exciting and a little daunting. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I needed it. Not to escape, but to celebrate. To embrace the freedom I'd found and the life I was rebuilding. "Let's do it," I said, a hint of excitement creeping into my voice. As we started brainstorming destinations, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine happiness. It wasn't the kind of fleeting joy that came from distraction or denial. It was deeper, rooted in the knowledge that I was finally moving forward. This wasn't the life I'd planned. It wasn't the life I'd imagined when I stood at the altar with Daniel, promising forever. But it was my life now, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was excited to see where it would take me. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the woman I'd been in Berlin, standing in that club and watching everything fall apart. She'd felt lost, broken, powerless. But she wasn't me anymore. I wasn't just surviving, I was living. And that, I realized, was the best revenge of all. The days melted into weeks, and life began to take on a new rhythm. One that didn't include Daniel. There were still moments when the thought of him would creep in, passing by a restaurant we used to frequent, hearing a song that reminded me of our long road trips, or finding one of his old t-shirts buried in a drawer I hadn't yet sorted. These moments stung, but they no longer consumed me. They were like faint echoes, reminders of a life that had passed but no longer held power over me. Work continued to keep me grounded, but it was the little things that truly began to fill the cracks. The morning ritual of coffee in my tiny kitchen, the sound of rain against the window as I curled up with a blanket and a book, the steady rhythm of my footsteps as I jogged through the park near my apartment, all of it began to feel like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Kate, ever the cheerleader of my healing process, didn't let me retreat too far into solitude. True to her word, she kept bringing up the idea of a trip. After much deliberation, we settled on Lisbon. It was a city neither of us had been to, with its winding streets, vibrant tiles, and the promise of sun-soaked afternoons by the sea. When the plane touched down, I felt a twinge of nervousness. Berlin had been such a pivotal, painful chapter in my story, and part of me feared that traveling again might dredge up memories I wasn't ready to face. But as soon as we stepped into the warm golden light of Lisbon's streets, my fears began to dissipate. The city was alive with color and music, its charm woven into every cobblestone and terrace. Kate and I wandered aimlessly, letting the city guide us. We found hidden cafes where the locals sipped tiny cups of espresso, rooftop bars with sweeping views of the ocean, and markets brimming with fresh seafood and vibrant produce. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, we sat at a small table outside a family-run restaurant. The air was filled with the scent of grilled sardines and the sound of fado music drifting from a nearby bar. "You seem different," Kate said, her tone casual but her gaze steady. I tilted my head, curious. "Different how?" "Lighter," she said after a moment. "Happier, maybe. Or freer." I considered her words, swirling the wine in my glass. "I think I am," I admitted. For a long time, I felt like my happiness was tied to someone else, like it depended on Daniel or the life we'd built together. But now, I don't know. I'm learning to be okay on my own, to find joy in the little things. Kate smiled, raising her glass. "To finding joy, then?" "To finding joy," I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. The trip was a turning point, not because of anything dramatic or life-changing, but because it reminded me of how vast the world was. For so long, my life had revolved around one person, one city, one set of routines. But there was so much more out there. So many places to explore, people to meet, experiences to savor. When I returned home, I threw myself into that mindset. I said yes to invitations I might have declined before, tried new things without overthinking them, and allowed myself to embrace the unknown. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, of fear. But each time I pushed through, proving to myself that I was capable of more than I'd ever realized. One weekend, I signed up for a photography workshop. It was something I'd always been interested in but never made time for. The instructor was a man named Adam, a quiet but passionate photographer with a knack for capturing raw, unfiltered moments. During the first session, he paired us off for an exercise. My partner was a woman named Clara, who had a sharp wit and a contagious laugh. We spent the afternoon wandering the city, our cameras in hand, finding beauty in the mundane. A cracked sidewalk, a shadow cast by a street lamp, the soft smile of a stranger. When we reconvened to share our photos, Adam paused on one of mine. A candid shot of a father and daughter sharing an ice cream cone on a park bench. "This," he said, his voice thoughtful, "is what photography is about. Capturing connection, emotion, life as it happens. Well done, Emma." His words stayed with me long after the class ended. It wasn't just about the compliment, it was about the realization that I could create something meaningful, something that resonated. For so long, I'd felt invisible, my identity swallowed by my role as Daniel's wife. But here, in this small moment, I was reminded that I was capable of so much more. Adam and I struck up a friendship during the course, often lingering after class to discuss techniques or share stories. He had an easy way about him, a quiet confidence that was both comforting and intriguing. He never pried into my personal life, but there was an unspoken understanding between us, an acknowledgement of the baggage we both carried. One evening after the final class, he invited me to join him for coffee. We sat in a cozy cafe, the kind with mismatched furniture and soft jazz playing in the background, and talked until the barista politely informed us they were closing. As we stepped out into the cool night air, he turned to me with a curious expression. "Do you ever feel like life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it?" I thought about everything that had happened, the heartbreak, the healing, the journey I was still on. "All the time," I said with a small smile. He nodded, his gaze steady. "I think that's what makes it worth it, though. The surprises, the moments you don't see coming." For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared to hope for possibility. It wasn't about Adam, or anyone else, really. It was about me, about the realization that my story was far from over, that there were chapters waiting to be written, filled with experiences I couldn't yet imagine. As I walked home that night, the city lights casting a warm glow on the streets, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For the pain that had pushed me to grow, For the people who had stood by me. For the new beginnings I was learning to embrace. Life wasn't perfect and it never would be. But it was mine. And for the first time in a long time that felt like enough. As the months passed, my life continued to evolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. The routines I'd established in my new apartment grew comforting. No longer a reminder of what I had lost but a foundation for the person I was becoming. The mornings were still my favorite time of day. The quiet solitude offering space to reflect and plan. I would sip my coffee by the window watching the world outside come to life. It was a small ritual but it felt significant, a reminder that I had control over my own peace. The photography class had awakened something in me, and I began spending more and more of my free time wandering the city with my camera. I started to notice things I'd overlooked before. The way sunlight filtered through tree branches, the fleeting expressions on people's faces, the quiet beauty of everyday life. Capturing these moments gave me a sense of purpose, a way to see the world with fresh eyes. One weekend, Clara, my class partner, invited me to join her for a local photography exhibit. It was held in a converted warehouse, the walls lined with stunning images that ranged from stark urban landscapes to intimate portraits. As we moved through the space, Clara nudged me and pointed to a series of black and white photographs. "Those remind me of your style," she said. I blinked at the compliment, unsure how to respond. It was strange to think of myself as having a style, but as I studied the photos, simple yet evocative, focused on raw emotion, I saw what she meant. "Maybe one day I'll have something good enough to hang here," I said lightly, though the thought felt impossibly distant. "You're closer than you think," Clara replied, her tone serious. Her words stayed with me long after we left the exhibit. That night, I flipped through the photos on my computer, seeing them with a new sense of possibility. Maybe I wasn't just capturing these moments for myself. Maybe there was something worth sharing. Something that might resonate with others the way those black and white images had resonated with me. In the weeks that followed, I started submitting my work to local competitions and online galleries. At first it felt daunting, putting myself out there, risking rejection. But the act of trying, of pushing past my own insecurities, was empowering in itself. To my surprise, one of my photos was accepted into a small gallery's monthly showcase. It was a candid shot of an older woman sitting on a park bench, her face lit by a serene smile as she watched a child play nearby. I remembered the moment clearly, the way the sunlight had caught the silver in her hair, the quiet contentment in her expression. The night of the showcase, I stood in the gallery surrounded by strangers, my photo hanging on the wall among a dozen others. People lingered in front of it, their faces thoughtful, and I felt a swell of pride that was both unfamiliar and exhilarating. Adam was there too, having heard about the showcase through Clara. He approached me with a warm smile, his hands tucked casually into his jacket pockets. "Congratulations," he said. "It's a beautiful shot." "Thank you," I replied, my voice tinged with nervous excitement. "I still can't believe it's actually here." He chuckled. "You should. You have an eye for this, Emma. Don't underestimate yourself." His encouragement meant more than I could